All right, good people. We're going to be going over chapter 21, Progressive Era, today. This is the lecture notes for that. So, the first thing we got to look at is what does the definition of progressive mean? What does that actually mean? And if you look at the word progressive in a dictionary, or if you look up the word progressive or think about the word progressive, that means change, to progress, to move forward slowly, gradually. And so that's what we're looking at during this time period. How are we going to, as a country, move forward and progress in some of the things that we need to do? It's also another word to look at it as reform, which we already talked about reform movements in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. And this is kind of the second era of that. Civil War put a damper in that, and then basically based on what happened afterwards with industrialization and a few other things, we now need to move forward as a country. So that's what progressive is. Who are progressives? Most of them are going to be middle class. If you think about it, most revolutions, most things start in the middle class and upper class. Why? Because they have impact. They have people that listen. I mean, you're thinking about the doctors, the lawyers, the ministers, the storekeepers. They have influence over decisions and over people. The professional class, who started to take civic responsibility serious. They started to look at what we can do to, as citizens, as the body of citizens, and how can we improve that. We also have religious groups that are going to. Most religious groups are now, instead of the gospel of wealth, or along with the gospel of wealth, we're teaching again some of those vices that people are engaged in, and looking at social responsibility. Also, the belief that people should care for the poor, belief that we should have honesty in public life, and belief that our country can improve and should improve in many different ways. What are the main philosophies of the progressive movement? So, if we look at what the progressives believe, they believe in new ideas and honest, efficient government, and that if we have those, we can bring about social justice and social change. Um, this belief in a practical approach that is based on morals and ideals and knowledge can actually bring about change. And one of the things we start using is scientific management. Frederick W. Taylor studied ways of organizing people to work in the most efficient ways possible. We can also extend that to government. So the object of political machines is to kind of control that. And if we kind of get rid of those, because political machines are not democratic and inefficient, we can fix some of those. So, what are some of the problems that they try to fix? Well, poverty, cities that are just filthy, factory workers are having issues with labor, child labor is going on at the time too, alcoholism, segregation, women's suffrage, corruption. Those are all things that we are trying to fix. Corruption, both in business and in politics. And who are the people that are going to start making those aware? Think about the people that you follow on social media, the influencers of the day. Whether you follow somebody that is um, a sports figure, or whether you follow someone that's a political figure or a religious figure, or maybe they are, they tackle different issues that are going on in the world and our country. Maybe you look at, or maybe you follow people that do dances or do singing or whatever. They have influence over you with whatever platform that they use, whether it's Instagram, whether it's TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, whatever. The influencers of the day were called muckrakers. And they were writers who helped inform people of some of the scandalous realities that are going on in things like politics, in factories, in cities, in slums. And they try to rouse public action to do something, because they're the ones that are if they can make you aware of the problems that are going on today, then you might want to take action. A couple examples are Lincoln Steffens, Jacob Riis, Upton Sinclair, Ida Tarbell, but there are plenty more that you can look at through this time period from 1901 to 1917, and even before then. I mean, we're really looking at 1890 to 1920 and beyond. And how do they do that? Mainly through publications such as magazines and books. One of the most famous muckraker publications was McClure's Magazine, and that was founded by Samuel Sidney McClure. And he was an Irish immigrant in 1893, and he combined research and sensationalism to get people aware. Two famous people that are famous progressives that worked for that magazine or wrote for that magazine were Lincoln Steffens and Jacob Riis and Ida Tarbell. Lincoln Steffens wrote articles for politics that were going on, and Ida Tarbell was she specifically focused on the Standard Oil Company and what is going on in Standard Oil and the corruption that's going on there. Other examples are books. Obviously, people read books. We didn't have the social media. We didn't have the Twitter. So people read books and magazines and even newspaper articles. Two examples of books. One is by Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives. And he combined photos and writing to show, the poverty that was going on in tenements, the poverty that was going on in these areas. Another example is Shame of the Cities by Lincoln Steffens. And in this one, he tried to expose the corruption in urban politics, in big city politics with the political bosses and whatnot. So that's how people got the word out. Other examples are Theodore Dreiser and Frank Norris, The Financier and the Titan. Talk about the greed and ruthlessness of industrialists. And then in Frank Norris's The Octopus, he talked about railroad corruption. He also wrote a book called The Pit, where he looked at speculation in the ag industry. And even though that was fictional accounts, it was based on reality. Probably the most famous book, however, is The Jungle. And The Jungle is a book by Upton Sinclair. And he went undercover in Chicago meatpacking plants to really expose the labor issues that were going on and the conditions that laborers worked in. And then he wrote a book called The Jungle. And we'll look at the impacts of that later on. But in reality, if you read excerpts of that, and I'll share excerpts of that later on, you're going to see just the terrible things that happen in the meatpacking industry with meat and whatnot going on there. So be on the lookout for those, or we will look at some excerpts from The Jungle, just looking at the terrible, terrible things that are going on in the meatpacking industry. When you read that, you wouldn't want to eat meat during that time. And so it again, rouses people to action, and that's the point. So different types of reforms that we're going to look at. Number one is going to be political reforms. We want to up the voter participation. We want to have more people that are voting. And so the first thing that we did is Australian or secret ballots. At the time you had political bosses, you had people that worked for political bosses, essentially running the voting areas. You wrote down your vote on a piece of paper, you handed it to somebody, and that was counted. And so you couldn't dare speak out. You couldn't dare vote for somebody who maybe isn't part of that political group. And so they encouraged us to use the Australian system, which is secretly voting for people in private booths. When you vote today, or when you guys are able to vote today, you'll vote for people, and then you'll slide it in it'll be covered. Nobody knows who you voted for. Nobody knows the person that you voted for. It's all kept secret, and that is to protect people and to allow people to vote maybe with conscience and not by fear or not by intimidation. We also started creating direct primaries. Instead of having political parties and people that are running political parties nominate people to run for president, to run for mayor, to run for senators, representatives. Now we are having the people. So in today's system, primaries are going on right now. We have the Republican and Democratic primaries that are going on right now to decide who is going to be our nominees for 2024. And that was created during this time where people nominate rather than party bosses or rather than nominating committee or nominating conventions. And this was all part of Robert La Follette's plan. He was a progressive governor of Wisconsin that introduced the primary system in 1903. By 1915, most states use some form of direct primary, and so the impact of that is now people get to decide who runs for office rather than corrupt bosses or the system. It didn't always work. Obviously, with any movement or anything going on, there's going to be some issues. Party bosses still found ways to manipulate some of those primaries. And southern states are going to end up using primaries, whites only primaries, to make sure that African Americans are not on the ballot and frankly aren't even voting in primaries. The next step is going to be direct election of senators. Prior to the 17th Amendment, most senators or all senators were elected by state legislators. And as we said before, they became known as Millionaires Club. They believed, or progressives believed, a lot like what the populists did, that this Millionaires Club in the Senate is helped or is created because of the system that we have. Nevada becomes the first state to do direct elections in 1899. And by 1912, 30 of the 48 states did direct elections, but we made it permanent for all states to do direct election of senators in 1913 with the 17th Amendment. Again, one of those populist movement beliefs that is adopted by the progressives. More political reforms: initiative, referendum, and recall. Initiatives are where voters use a petition and they put a bill on a ballot. The most obvious example of that, it was marijuana. In the last two elections that we've had, marijuana has legalized marijuana for recreational use and legalized marijuana for medicinal use has been on the ballot, and that has been initiated by voters. So voters initiate through a petition, and maybe you went to the mall, maybe you have gone to the gas stations and you've had people say, hey, can you sign this petition? If you're over 18, you can sign it. Another example is referendum, and this is where legislators decide, hey, maybe this issue is too serious that we should put it to the people. We should allow the people to vote. The most obvious example of that in South Dakota has been abortion. The legislators have not wanted to tackle abortion. They wanted to bring it up to the people. So there's been a referred amendment or referred law, and that is where legislators refer bills to the people. And then you vote on it. And the third one is recall, the ability to remove corrupt officials before their term is up through a recall. That is done by the state. Right now, that is not a national thing. That is a state thing. And fun fact, South Dakota was the first to do the initiative and referendum in 1898. So we set the bar for that in 1898. Another example of a progressive movement was the social welfare. We already talked about Jane Addams and settlement houses. You also can look at Florence Kelley, who tried to fight against child labor and tried to fight against women labor, not women in labor. I was going to say women labor, and allowing equal pay, equal opportunity, and as well as racial discrimination in employment. The whole goal of social welfare is to try to improve urban life, improve life in cities, and that's kind of what we're focusing on with social welfare. Another example of different reforms that were there are municipal reforms, and try to break up the power that city bosses have on municipalities, on city and local governments. And when we talk about municipal government, we're talking about city and local. And a couple ways that they did that is through making sure that the utilities are publicly owned. So when you pay your water bill, most of the time the water is done by the city. Sometimes gas and electric and transportation are done by the city. So Sioux Falls has our own busing system, but we do have private companies use gas and electric. However, that is kind of run by the cities. And this third one is going to be manager council plan. Instead of just having a mayor that decides on things, we have council members. So we have city council members. We have counselors that help make decisions. Instead of putting it in one person's hand, you put it in multiple people's hands. And then the last one that we'll talk about for now is going to be temperance and prohibition. And we've already talked about temperance before with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Carrie Nation. But there are multiple reasons for the temperance movement. Saloons were oftentimes the headquarters of political machines. And in some cases, women were not allowed. Women were barred from some of these saloons. And so we need to try to fix that. And people would go to these political meetings, get liquored up, and just be terrible, lazy people, whether or not it was lazy husbands, lazy fathers, or lazy workers, kind of all the above. So this is going to lead to prohibition, the 18th Amendment. And the 18th Amendment was the abolition of liquor. And the people that were prohibitionists were known as the dries. That's why when we look at like dry counties, dry cities, dry states, we're talking about counties and cities and states that don't allow alcohol. So most campuses are considered dry campuses. Most areas are considered dry areas. And so that's what we're talking about. So let's look at the progressive presidents. And the progressive presidents really start with Teddy Roosevelt. He became the first progressive president. And then William Taft and Woodrow Wilson are also considered those. But first, let's talk about Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt talked about the 3 C's. After McKinley is assassinated in 1901, he became the youngest president we have ever had. Not the youngest president we've ever had elected, but the youngest president we have ever had. He was only 42 years old, which I know you guys think is ancient, but that's actually younger than I am. And he became president of the United States in 1901. He thought that the president should take a more active role in some of these things, specifically in our economy, in society, and in politics. And so he implemented his 3 C's. And the first one is going to be control of corporations. His plan was known as the Square Deal. And he promised a square deal, equal on all sides, for business and labor. And the reason why it's square is it's equal. If you look at a square, it has equal sides. And so let's make sure business and labor have kind of equality in that. The most common or obvious example of this was the anthracite coal strike in Pennsylvania. And there was a coal mine that the coal miners striked, if that's a word, went on strike. And since most Americans and most Pennsylvanians used coal to heat their homes, the coal miners realized that if we just hold out, the people will get so mad at the strikers that they will have to come to work and they'll have to do what they need to do. So what Teddy Roosevelt did is he actually invited both the White House, both the mine workers, the strikers, and the mine owners, the bosses, to the White House to negotiate. Well, the mine owners didn't. They didn't want to go. They didn't want to negotiate. They thought that they had leverage. And so Teddy Roosevelt becomes mad. And so instead of the workers or the bosses going, they actually sent people in their place. And Teddy Roosevelt was quoted as saying, if I weren't the president, I would have thrown them out on their tails. But because he was president, he felt like he needed to maybe be a little bit more respectful in that matter. However, it didn't change what he did. He threatened to use federal troops to take over the mines. And essentially kicked the bosses out, federalized the mine, and used troops to run it. And that's what he does. And for the first time in history, if you remember the last 3 strikes we looked at, every time the government was called in, they came in and were pro-boss, pro-big business. And this time, Teddy Roosevelt actually was on the side of the strikers. and he got them what they wanted, which was a 10% wage increase and a 9-hour workday rather than, the 10, 12-hour workdays that they were using. He also was known as the trust-busting president. Really was the first president to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act. And in 1904, the Supreme Court actually upheld Roosevelt's use of the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up the Northern Securities Company, which was a railroad trust. He also, in his trust busting, made a distinction, made sure that we realized that there was a difference between good trusts and bad trusts. And bad trusts were those that harmed consumers by raising prices and stifling competition. And good trusts were those that dominated the market through efficiency and low prices. So he didn't bust all trusts, just the ones that were bad. He also started to regulate the railroads. He regulated railroads. Oh, not quite. He regulated railroads with the Elkins Act and Hepburn Act, which strengthened the regulatory power of the ICC and allowed the ICC to fix just and reasonable rates for the railroads. He also focused on consumer protection. That's the second C, consumer protection. And this is where the jungle comes in. In the jungle, he read the jungle and was just appalled at what was going on. And so the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act were passed. And those were to protect consumers from tainted meat. The Pure Food and Drug prohibited manufacture, sale, and transportation of contaminated or mislabeled foods and drugs. And then the Meat Inspection Act allowed federal inspection of meatpacking plants just to make sure that they were following sanitation standards. And the third C is conservation of natural resources. And so he became really the first conservation president, realizing that industrialization hurts the environment. And so he became the first president to really use the Forest Reserve Act, which was passed about 30 years prior. And he set aside 150 million acres of federal land as national reserves. He also passed the Newlands Reclamation Act, which created money or provided money for the sale of public land for irrigation projects in Western states. He also promoted a coordinated effort between federal and state governments to try to have states focus on themselves. He didn't want to have the federal government have the only power. And so he encouraged states to do their part as well. So that's Teddy Roosevelt. Now William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft followed along with Teddy Roosevelt's progressive movement stuff, maybe not all of it, but a lot of his progressive movement stuff. We were talking about the Mann-Elkins Act, which gave the ICC power to suspend new railroad rates, which was proposed by Roosevelt and passed under Taft. He also prosecuted more antitrust cases than Roosevelt, almost double the amount of antitrust cases. He also got the 16th Amendment passed. Now, if you know anything about government, president really doesn't have a ton to do with it, but they can propose it. The 16th Amendment, which authorized an income tax, which is sometimes popular, sometimes not, was ratified in 1913, which basically allowed the government to tax income. And so it's forcing the rich to kind of pay their share. However, there was a rift in the Republican Party, and the Republican Party starts to split for a couple reasons. Obviously, we know that Teddy Roosevelt wasn't a big fan of Taft in the long run, and a couple things that led to that. Number one, Payne-Aldrich tariff. Taft promised to lower tariffs. Instead, he actually defended a bill publicly and signed a bill that raised tariffs on most imports. So that ticked a lot of progressive Republicans off. Then you have the Pinchot-Ballinger controversy, which progressives really liked Guilford Pinchot, who was a conservationist and was chief of the Forest Service. And Pinchot criticized Ballinger, who was Taft's Secretary of the Interior, for opening lands for private development rather than conservation. And so Taft fired Pinchot, and that really ticked off a lot of progressive movement people, progressive-minded Republicans. The third example is the House Speaker Joe Cannon. Taft refused to support progressive efforts to reduce the power of the Speaker of the House, who was Joe Cannon, who was a conservative. And that's all. They just ticked off a bunch of progressive Republicans at that point. And in the midterm elections, Taft mostly supported conservatives over progressives, which is going to be a massive mistake. This is going to lead to, so this is midterm, this is 1910. So this is going to lead to Roosevelt and other progressives looking at different options, which we know Roosevelt runs for a second term. We also see a rise in the Socialist Party. And they started out as a labor party, and they favored many radical reforms, more radical than the progressives were. Things like public ownership of railroads, utilities, and industry. And this was maybe too much for most people to kind of go. So even the progressive Republicans weren't in favor of some of the socialist movements. Most famous is obviously Eugene Debs, who was the founder of the Socialist Party and worked with labor unions for years. He was a part of railroad strikes in the past. He was jailed multiple times. He also runs for president as a Socialist Party member 5 different times, even ran once while in jail in 1920. We're going to talk about the 1912 election, but one thing we didn't speak on was kind of the shift or the rift. Roosevelt's new platform becomes known as New Nationalism, and this is more government regulations versus Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, who wanted to limit big government and big business together. At this point in time, Taft was so unpopular that he just wasn't going to win the election, even though Republicans chose him, and Debs was just too radical. And so those are your 2 options. The outcomes became obvious. We already know Wilson won, but only 41% of the country actually voted for him. So he's already has 59% of the population that does not agree with him. But he becomes president anyway. And Woodrow Wilson does a couple things. One, he votes for banking reform. He says that we need to have banking reform. In his new freedom, he attacked this triple wall of privilege for people, and that's in tariffs, that's in banking, that's in trusts. And he thought that we should restore fair competition to the marketplace. He passed the Clayton Antitrust Act, which strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act, which exempted labor unions from being prosecuted by trusts. He installed the Federal Trade Commission, which was a regulatory agency with power to investigate and take action against unfair trade practices in industries, except for banking and transportation. So again, focusing on some of those trusts and industries. He also passed the Federal Farm Loan Act and the Child Labor Act in 1916, which prohibited the interstate shipment of products manufactured by children under 14. However, this was seen to be unconstitutional, but it was still proved that he was a reformer president. Big group that started to want to focus on rights were the African Americans in the progressive era. We already looked at Ida B. Wells Barnett, but the 2 biggest ones, two I guess Mount Rushmore people that we're going to talk about were Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. They both believed in equality of the races, and obviously in the South we have a lot of segregation going on. Booker T. Washington was a Southerner who was born into slavery. He will become the head of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. He was one of the most influential, and probably at the turn of the century, he was the most influential leader. He argued that blacks needed education and economic progress, and they were of the foremost importance. And the education that he focused on was industrial arts. So that would be like going to Southeast Tech or Mitchell Tech or Lake Area. Some of those industrial skills, and after establishing that economic base, African Americans can then achieve political and social equality. If you look at his background in slavery, he believes that it should happen more slowly. He believes it's going to happen more slowly because you can't just turn on a faucet of equality. W.B. Du Bois, who was born in the North after slavery in an integrated area, he went to an integrated school. He was the valedictorian of that school, and he believed in education. He believed that the talented 10% that are going to go on in education and be educated are going to lead the people out. I have 20 seconds left. So Great Migration is going to happen during the 1910 and 1930, where you have over 1 million African Americans moving to the North for factories because of Jim Crow laws and cotton crops. We have different organizations such as these.